So how do you actually design FAR transfer training then? Because I'd mentioned that it is not easy. And honestly, am I going to be able to do this justice in a very short amount of time in the 13 minutes we have left? No, but I'll give you a high level. And then again, I will encourage you, read Ruth's book, and then you might even want to work with an expert on how to do it with your own project. So how you do it. So as I mentioned, Ruth goes into much greater detail in her book, but to summarize, the first step is you develop your guidelines. And this is even before you write your learning objectives, okay? You need to understand what your guidelines are. And your guidelines, the most important thing, are they actually valid guidelines? Do they result in the desired behavior or the desired outcome that you're trying to train up? That's how you know whether they're valid. And there's basically two general kinds of approaches in terms of how you start to develop your guidelines, how you start to identify what those are. One is by drawing on external research. So maybe your Gartner research, maybe research that's specific to your industry. There may be some established guidelines that are already in place. So that might be one starting point. Another starting point is an analysis of best practices. So if this is a FAR transfer task that's specific to your company, the work that you do, you might have a very specific way that you do it. And so for that, then you want to look at high performers, medium performers, et cetera, and validate against those best practices. And quite honestly, you can also do a combination of those things. For myself, I talk about how I like to corroborate research and corroborate data points from different sources. So yes, I might have Gartner research that I use as one of my research sources. I might also have documentation on a Confluence site or on a wiki page or in a Slack channel. Those are all things that I can data scrape pretty quickly. Similarly, I might choose to interview a number of people. I might choose to listen to recorded interviews that have been done in the past. All of these are different data sources that, especially if you know how to do data scraping, you can actually pull that data together very, very quickly. This is one of the things that I offer in how I do rapid strategy analysis work. A lot of times people, when they do needs assessment, needs analysis, that kind of work in learning and development, that takes months. I do it in weeks. And I do it in weeks because, again, taking advantage of my Python data scraping skills to do that. So that's the first step, is finding out what those guidelines are and making sure that they're valid. So once you have your valid guidelines for your FAR transfer task, then you write your objectives, your learning objectives. And again, I want to remind you, you write those at the application level or the applied level. So it's not about listing the steps or listing the guidelines. It's about applying the guidelines in the appropriate situation under the appropriate circumstances. And so simply recalling is the remember level, and that's not what we're looking for. And so then that would suggest that they need to respond to realistic job scenarios by appropriately applying those guidelines. So that's going to come up again when we start talking about how you select your instructional approach and how you design your training. Once you've got your objectives written, then you move into your instructional approach. And with your instructional approach, when it comes to FAR transfer tasks, there's a couple of different approaches you could take. And it could be a preference approach. It could be based on your audience, but generally two general kinds of approaches. One is called the instructive or a direct instruction approach, which is where you would state the principle, you would state the guidelines, maybe you would follow up with a little bit of a rationale, the what's in it for me, or why it's important that we do the principle this particular way. And then you would start to apply that to those guidelines, that principle, to examples, okay? So that's one approach, the instructive approach, direct instruction, starting off by telling, stating, and then giving examples. Now we can contrast that with an inductive or more of a constructivist approach, which is where you would provide several examples or scenarios, and from those examples or scenarios, you would derive the principles and the guidelines from those examples. So another theorist that I subscribe to, and I've done a lot of my own work is grounded in, is Susan Markle. And so Susan Markle refers to these as the rule egg approach. The rule, you state the rule and then give the examples, versus the egg rule approach, where you start with examples and derive the rule from that. And what I'm going to point out here, and I've written about this, so if you've read some of my work on machine learning, this will come up. This is not that different from how machine learning works. So if we think about instructive approaches where we state the guidelines, that's not that different from supervised learning. And if we think about the inductive approach, where we derive the guidelines and derive the principle from examining multiple examples, that's not unlike an unsupervised learning approach. So I just want to throw that out there and put a little pin in it for now. Okay, so you selected your instructional approach. You've gone either directive or you've gone inductive, but both of those approaches suggest that you're going to need to have varied context examples. And so when you're writing out your examples, this is the circumstances under which those guidelines would be applied, right? And so for me, to make sure that you're doing a really, really comprehensive job of this, you develop what's called a minimal rational set. And so what are those varied context examples so people know when to apply it? And if you want to be really, really clear on it, you also include varied context non-examples where it might seem like this is an appropriate situation to apply the guidelines, but there's one thing maybe that's off about it that the guidelines wouldn't apply. So those are what I would call like those close-in non-examples. They're almost an example, but not quite. And quite honestly, those are some of the best learning opportunities there, is if you have really, really well-selected non-examples as well as really well-constructed examples of when to apply the guidelines. Both really help. And then finally, another piece that you might want to include in your instructional approach is analogies, because this can help learners actually build the mental models they need to be able to apply the guidelines appropriately. That said, an analogy is only effective if the basis of the analogy is already known to the learner. So you need to be aware of what your learners already know and don't know. Otherwise, the analogy may not land. And especially if it's a novice learner, it's just going to be more confusing for the learner to throw in an analogy if it doesn't resonate. So those are some of the pieces that you want to think about in terms of your instructional approach, whether you're taking inductive or instructive approach, developing your varied context examples and non-examples, and then finally, if applicable and there is a meaningful analogy, to include those as well. And then finally, the last step is to actually design your training. And Ruth presents extensive guidelines. So again, whether you're designing for a digital medium or whether you're designing for classroom, lots and lots of examples of how to do it specifically in her book. So really, really good guidance there. But what I will say is that, and you probably have already determined this from what I've been describing for the instructional approach, there's an instruction piece and then there's a practice piece. And a lot of times when we're developing learning materials, we just design the instructional piece without the practice piece. And arguably, it's in the practice where most of the learning occurs, where the learner is responding to a specific scenario and they're getting feedback on that response. So just doing the one and done, here's an example in my instructional piece, that's not going to do it, especially when it comes to FAR transfer, and especially if the guidelines are challenging to determine and challenging to distinguish. You want to be able to give learners multiple opportunities to respond with feedback so that they know whether or not they've applied the guidelines appropriately. And so the big takeaway here then, regardless of whether you're doing a classroom approach or whether you're doing a virtual approach, is that you want the scenarios to be real world, lifelike, scenario-based. And the way that you actually design your training, it could be a blended approach. You definitely might want to include projects as part of the transfer, and simulations might come to bear as well.